Ashivenu, Ashivenu, Adonai Elecha, Venashuva, Ashivenu, Ashivenu, Adonai Elecha, Venashuva, Venashuva, Hadish, Hadish, Yameinu Kedem. Ashivenu, Ashivenu, Adonai Elecha, Venashuva, Venashuva. Good evening, friends. So great to be with you all and having this discussion, especially these particularly timely discussions. Um, we're talking tonight about institutional teshuva, what are the obligations of an institution that has caused harm? And one of the questions that has come up is, what even counts as harm? I should be clear. One of the questions that has come up in some of the materials considered in advance of this class, not from Rabbi Ruttenberg's book, is what counts as harm? What is the institutional responsibility for the behavior of people employed by or affiliated with the institution? So I want to name, I got two submissions this week. One was from Sharon Amasha about the Sackler family, Purdue Pharmaceuticals, that have so far completely failed to take any institutional responsibility or do any institutional teshuva for their role in promoting opioids and really causing and expanding the opioid epidemic. I think the Sackler family is a great case study in the way we have a culture that militates away from teshuva. A person cannot do teshuva while they are being sued and while they are fighting a lawsuit. Their lawyers will completely advise against it. So Sharon, you were out for a minute, but I was just reflecting on your submission of the Sackler family as a case. We also got a submission of this story that I'm going to put in the chat about it's a New York Times article from today about the congressional hearings of tech companies and the harm. Why am I not able to paste this? And the harm caused by tech companies to children. the Senate Judiciary Committee was holding a child safety online hearing, and Mark Zuckerberg's heartfelt but contentless apology to families of children who have been harmed in the online arena. I think that was like a really interesting case because I noticed in reading this article that the senators who were attacking these big tech giants are not necessarily people that I trust to have the welfare of children in mind. I mean, some of these are the same people who are denying the humanity, denying the complexity of gender non-binary children's identity. And yet they're extremely righteously infuriated at the harm that tech companies have caused. And so what does that mean when an institution wants to hold somebody else accountable for doing teshuva? What does it mean when the institutions that we entrust with accountability are not capable of making people do teshuva, or themselves are guilty of the same transgressions that they are trying to hold others accountable for? And then finally, I'm just going to lay out the third case, which is the one I emailed all of you last night. And certainly some of you may not have seen it, so I'm placing the link in the chat again. We have the case of Hebrew College, which has barred a faculty member, has barred its founder from setting foot on campus after an allegation of harm that is in some ways, I think, really questionable, or at least raises questions about spectra of harm. So juicy, and as Julie Raskin points out, all Jews, so juicy and so juicy. So Carrie Walters Warren wants to say something. We are still recording though.
Oh, that's fine.
So
I just
is going to be on the record.
One more additional complicating example that we don't have to talk about, but I immediately thought of when thinking about all this was because I work in child welfare and human services, and I teach on this. The child welfare system had a horrible harm that was done to Native American children in this country, removing them from families. We then had a repair in many ways with the federal government then putting out the Indian Child Welfare Acts saying, okay, we're not going to do this anymore, even though there's still obviously a huge amount of racism. But we'll put that aside for a minute. This was happening. We had a law saying that it's no longer allowed to do this. It was almost like repairing that, saying, no, this is not okay. And then just last year, the courts were possibly going to take that away. And part of the argument was because there was not a recognition of the history of the needs of repair, right? It was like, oh, this isn't fair to treat Indian children separate. But the argument was, it's only not fair if you don't know the harm that was originally done. So I thought that was just another complicated, interesting institutional aspect.
The great example of the way that as I think I said in the first class, to do teshuva is not a one and done thing, right? To do teshuva for a serious harm is akin to being in recovery, forever, for the rest of one's life, or for the rest of the life of an institution. So just to recap what Carrie said, for those who don't know, I assume most of us do, for many, many decades, it was policy of the US government to coerce Indigenous Americans into giving up their children to schools run by the Bureau of Indian Affairs, to boarding schools. And it is known that children died at those schools, that children were abused at those schools in very high numbers, that there was really a cultural devastation also that was wrought there. Children were punished for speaking their language, for wearing their clothes. And so the sorry, what is the Indian Child Welfare
Yep.
Act?
Yep. Exactly.
Was in some ways an act of confession for that and a framework for repair, for making sure that, sort of as in Maimonides' first halacha in chapter 2 of Teshuvah, that that when faced with the possibility of doing this again, the US government would not do this
Right.
anymore. So that's great as long as the US government remains vigilant
Right.
about repairing the harm that was caused. But as soon as we start rejecting truth telling, as soon as we refuse to tell our history, then we're no longer on the Teshuvah wagon.
Right.
And so, yeah, I think it's a great example.
Yeah.
It's a great example of how Teshuvah can never be said to be completed, but can only said to be happening or to not be happening. Okay, there's some really interesting comments coming into the chat. Okay, so there's a question in the chat. Should or how should colleges and universities generally allow faculty to do teshuva when the power dynamics and possibly age differentials of students and faculty are involved, the students and faculty who are involved with egregious transgressions? Right. So one thing that we all kind of reacted to back in our first session when we studied Maimonides' laws of teshuva is that Maimonides says one of the things the Baal Teshuvah, the person who is doing Teshuvah, has to do is go into exile. And I think many of us looked at that and were like, whoa. And yet, I think there is also some wisdom there. The most analogous thing to exile that exists in our culture is what would be termed cancellation or deplatforming, right? Literally going into exile means you don't get to be in the same space that you were. That is part of doing teshuva. You leave the space or the spaces that you inhabited and you say, I know I don't get to be there right now. And you do that voluntarily. So if a person in power has caused harm from their place of power, part of their responsibility in doing teshuva is to say, you know what? I have abused my power in this situation. I need to take some time away, make sure that the people I have harmed feel that all the repair has happened, and then very humbly ask if it's permissible for me to come back. Right? That's the idea. I would say that is the ideal, and that's the analog of Maimonides saying go into exile. Now, I think some of you, and perhaps this comes generationally too, may have read this story and been like, did Rabbi Art Green do something that wrong? And I think that's like a really important question to ask because there are gradations of harm and there are different definitions of harm. And so some of us might say, for example, since this is a case of like unwanted sexual encounter, right? I think all of us would say physically forced penetrative sexual encounter is harm, is wrong. The person who did that needs to do teshuva. That is victim-centered. An organization that enabled that needs to do teshuva. That is public, that is victim-centered, that is confessional. Many of us now would say, even if it was not physically coercive, if it was emotionally coercive and that happened, same thing. Many of us would say if someone created a toxic environment that was sexually harassing or harassing for any other reason of someone who was clearly uncomfortable, that's a clear harm that teshuva needs to be done for. I think what's so interesting about this case at Hebrew College is we have someone who crossed a line, who received a no, and then who immediately backed up and said, "Oh, I'm so sorry. Okay, I won't do this anymore." And then the institution reacted in all the ways. So some of us might feel like, ooh, the institution got too involved. Some of us might feel like, oh, this person is being quoted sounding very unrepentant, still needs to be held more accountable. Some of us might feel like maybe the victim, such as it is, who is unnamed and I don't know who it is overreacting. And I think it raises a lot of questions about like how much of a power differential makes any kind of sexual invitation automatically wrong. Um, and who is responsible for that at the various gradations of that interaction. We're still recording, so I'll take hands with the understanding that for now, we're still recording, and then after those hands have run out, I'll turn off the recording and see if anyone else wants to share. Julie, go ahead.
Okay, I don't know, this might be an unpopular thought, but like when a man does this to another man, everybody freaks out. Like I think Kevin Spacey is never going to come back the way other celebrities who harassed women are. So I think there's an ick factor here that I can kind of feel in this story, because he did this to another man. So it raises the whole, homophobia thing. So I don't know if other people feel that way about the way institutions like suddenly take it so seriously when a man does this to another man.
You're getting a thumbs up from one person and another. I think that is probably true in the case of many institutions. I'm not sure that it's true in the case of Hebrew College as led by President Sharon Cohen Annisfeld.
I don't mean that the people involved like are homophobic. I mean, it's like it just like everybody gets alarmed in a way that I think it's like, well, we all know that men harass women. When they harass men, I don't know. I just think it's
more of a taboo that has been breached.
Yeah, and just this description of the hotel room and everything, it just felt like there was something icky about all that, tone-wise. And maybe it was the foreword, or maybe it was, but it was also the situation was unexpected. And the way the article did it was kind of unexpected. And then I just felt like there was something like taking it more seriously or something. That's all.
Okay. Yeah, that's a hypothesis we have to live with. Barbara, yes, you've been waiting.
Well, no, and I just want to say that when I read the article closely, I kind of thought it smacked of homophobia too. And I don't, as you said, I'm not sure where that was coming from, but it crossed through my mind. So you weren't the only one, Julie.
Carrie, go ahead.
But just kind of said it in the chat, but I think it's almost like, homophobia is kind of in the air we breathe, even if we don't consciously believe it. And so the fact that I think you can't say that's not a factor at all just because it's in the air we breathe. So it's going to be a little bit of an extra ick factor, even if people don't want it to be, possibly in the overall institutional feel, even if it's not any of the primary kind of factors. It's still like hanging out in the air, most probably.
Probably. Yeah, thank you for making explicit that piece that was implicit. Ken, go ahead.
I had two reactions to your article. Thank you for posting it. It's pretty intense, deciding how I feel as everything was written, as I read the article. First, this is not just the student-teacher relationship. He is a rabbi, and he's not only a rabbi, but he's the founder of the college. So the power differential, I mean, between him and the student, and also the expectations because of how high he is, I think differ from just any run-of-the-mill teacher that did something like this. But I couldn't get the feeling that there was ever any, with all the good he had accomplished, that there was ever any pathway for him to be rehabilitated. And that was disturbed. He'd done so much good and just throw him away.
Yeah. Someone who isn't here with us tonight, but emailed me before class, sort of pointed out, these cases that we're talking about, this case that I emailed you, is much murkier than the cases in the books. So what does it mean to expect someone to do teshuva when it seems like, I actually think a lot of what Rabbi Green said to the JTA was defensive and offensive and unconscionable. But he did say something about like it feeling like there was no pathway to teshuva. And every time he thought he was doing it well, the institution sort of threw up more roadblocks and more conditions. And so we can hold that as like just that cultural ick factor of like, what does it mean for a Jewish institution to maybe not be clear about what its pathway to teshuva is, or to add more conditions on what its pathway to teshuva is, and say like that's really problematic. And also to say, and in point of fact, in terms of the specifics of what he did, maybe the harm was not that bad, except for the position he was in as the rabbi, as the founder, as the mentor of the person that he made a pass at. Caitlin, go ahead.
Thanks. Yeah, I was gonna say it's interesting because like teshuva, when you're doing it to make repair with another person and they're setting the goalposts, I think it's one of those tricky things where like maybe you really think, right, it could be either way. Maybe you really think that your first proposal of like this will make me whole, this will make it better, this will feel better, and then that happens and you're like, ooh, actually I still don't feel better. Like this didn't actually do the repair that I wanted it to. And so like let's try this other thing instead. So I can see I can see both sides of how like you want to be able to have that develop and evolve to kind of reach some sort of healing place, but I also can see it feeling or being a little bit just sorry, I'm not pinpointing the word at the end of my long day today, but it can just feel capricious. Like it can just feel like you're constantly moving and there's not actually a way to make repair and heal. And so, how can you hold space for both of those things to be true and genuine? Like, I truly thought that this was going to be the thing that would make it feel better and make it whole and do the repair. And oops, it didn't. And also being the other person being like, this doesn't, it just feels like you're creating this moving target and nothing can actually happen um to make it whole. And also it's really interesting when it's institutional to me. Sorry. It's really interesting when it's institutional because it means that there's supposed to be an end date, but it feels like I mean, I agree with your point on recovery. Like you're always making the better choice. You're always trying to do better. And so I don't know that there can be like a checklist for, oh, now I fixed it. Now it's done. Now my process is over. Anyway, those are all kind of the things that are swirling in my head as I'm processing all the examples that have come up so far.
Right, and I can imagine, and apologies, like maybe I should have given a trigger warning. We kind of launched into this, but if I had experienced this, a mentor making a pass at me, right? Like I might not even be clear how shocked or angry or reactive I felt for days or weeks or months. And that has to be okay, right? That I communicate that once I become clear how I feel about it. Now I see some questions in the chat about like the institution's responsibility. My understanding from this article and several other articles I have read is that the institution responded immediately to an incident that happened a couple of years ago, and was guided by the victim of that incident, who was a faculty member, a new faculty member, in the process that that person wanted, which included setting certain requirements and demanding that Rabbi Green never be alone in the room with anyone else from the institution, etc. And explicitly guided by this person, did not make a public statement because that was not what the person wanted. Now, that's a really interesting thing from a victim's rights perspective, so to speak. If an institution has someone who has made a pass at people with less positional power, and they know of only at a person, and they know of only one person, and that person does not want it to go public, how much is it the institution's responsibility to respect the wishes of that person versus the responsibility to nonetheless go public for the sake of ensuring that it never happens again, for the sake of doing teshuva? How much is it the institution's responsibility to apologize for this if it really had never happened before that they were aware of? Does the institution need to confess after the first time it happens if they're immediately taking steps to make sure it never happens again? That's all a lot of questions. Barbara.
So it actually, that is a lot of questions. Now I'm thinking about them, but when I raised my hand, what I was also thinking about is, you know, he said, I was very drunk, I was very stoned. Those are like red flags to me. I feel nervous when people who did something inappropriate, I don't think it's taking responsibility when you say I was really drunk or I was really stoned. And so that kind of is, that got my attention because that seems like implicitly not taking responsibility. That's all.
Well, we reveal our inclinations when we intoxicate ourselves. So as a description of fact, maybe it's not a problem, but as an excuse, it's very much a problem.
To me.
Yeah. So, okay, I'm going to turn off the recording in case other people want to share. So we've come to a point where there seems to be, if not a consensus, an idea that no one has contradicted, that what's complicated about this case is the sexual element, right? There's just really quickly changing cultural norms around this that make it generationally extremely loaded. And also the fact that there is a particular individual who has caused harm, but it is in an institutional context, and that basically it is the institution's responsibility to guard against the creating of those contexts, right? It's the institution's responsibility to have a culture where faculty and students, for example, are not getting so intoxicated together that their boundaries are going to be blurred. And if that isn't clear, then there is a problem that the institution needs to take responsibility for. It is the institution's responsibility, perhaps also, in a case where a faculty member is at risk of perpetrating because of their own pain, because of a bunch of life factors, to make sure to be giving that faculty member support proactively instead of responding reactively. Let's admit that's a very high bar for an institutional response. That's a very, very aspirational. I don't know of a whole lot of institutions that would be capable of noticing when people in power within them are at risk of causing harm because of their own like psychosocial life circumstance factors. But I do think it's a beautiful thing for an institution to do teshuva for, or a beautiful thing for an institution to try to reckon with as part of teshuva. So we're going to zoom out a little bit and talk about some concepts from this chapter, recognizing as we have broken down that actually this is not as simple as perhaps Rabbi Ruttenberg's framing would like it to be. But so what I want you to look at is the bottom of page 101, starting with investigating the nature and perhaps the limits. To the next page, it must be a whole holistic effort. And we can talk and like, let's talk more in detail in your small groups about what are the barriers to this kind of institutional teshuva. Can you think of institutions that have really performed it? How and where do institutions tend to fall short? And what role might we have in holding institutions we care about accountable to creating what I'd call this culture of teshuva? If you feel like that's not juicy enough for you, oh, why did, I'm putting those questions in the chat. If you feel like that's not juicy enough for you, I'm not sure why it's showing up as a live link. It's not a live link to anywhere. If you talk about that and you're like, ah, this is not that interesting, look at page 106, starting at the bottom, although the traditional approach, to page 107 at the bottom for that particular organization, talking about the benefits of an organizational culture of teshuva, and you can discuss that. Let's take 18 minutes, and then we'll come back together with 12 minutes to debrief. All right, breakout groups. All right, welcome back, everyone. So we pulled out of our particular case and had, or perhaps tried to have, a more theoretical conversation about institutional teshuva, the challenges, the benefits of it. And I invite you to share any insights that you'd like to share from your small groups.
I guess something I'm thinking about now maybe harkens back to something that someone said a little bit earlier, which is like, how do you set institutional norms and then either teach those explicitly and teach the the codes explicitly so that these boundaries don't get accidentally crossed, and we can have the institution hold that space and then provide training, for lack of a better word, about how we're going to operate within that space. So that we know when we've crossed a boundary, and when we have teshuva that we need to do and that we've made a error. Yeah, so we kind of talked around that, but that's what I'm processing right now, is like, what's it mean to be like collegial, and what's it mean to be professional, and what does it mean to be friendly, and what does it mean to be a friend, and how can you have space for all of those kinds of relationships without the organization kind of holding it in a big bucket and setting some of that, so that we have this standard of, I think morality was the question that came up before, but so that we have these kind of shared norms and expectations that we can hold each other to and hold ourselves to and fix when we break them.
And it's really hard because culture changes faster than organizations do. Right? Like organizations are, unless they're very small, startup-y organizations, I was like, culture changes faster than institutions do. Institutions are going to respond to cultural shifts, but they're not going to be at pace with them. Julie.
We also talked about, Sarah and Joy, correct me if I get this wrong, but we talked about a lot of things, but one of the things we talked about was the importance of recognizing the ubiquity of harm, the ubiquity of people who abuse and of people who are abused, because if we say that the abuser is this individual monster, then then the person who has been harmed thinks they're the only one. They think it's something that they did. We're not taking responsibility as a culture for how normal it is for people to do harm. And so that we started looking at these sort of individuals as anomalies, as opposed to a culture and that these things happen in.
I think that's a really beautiful insight. Right, one of the consequences of being serious about institutional teshuva, particularly institutional teshuva for a harm caused by an individual, is that it, saying, hey, we created the conditions for this to happen, implicitly makes the perpetrator less unique, right? Less uniquely monstrous. And in some ways, right, some of the examples in Rabbi Ruttenberg's book about institutions attempting to making strides in failing to do teshuva for institutional racism and historical instances, or still profiting off of institutional racism, like the power of the institution doing that precisely comes from the institution not saying like, oh, well, there was this evil person who was on the first board of directors, so we are excising the memory of them, or condemning the memory of them, but from saying like, hey, this was the entire institutional culture for which we take responsibility, and that particular perpetrator was not unique in what he or she, usually he, as these conversations are going, did. And often when that's not what happens, right? When we are just like rejecting the memory of a particular individual, it is noticed and called out as kind of a failure of teshuva, right? If we're just renaming a building that was named after a white supremacist, then everybody's clear like, oh, well, that's extremely performative and not actually deep. So when the institution takes responsibility, it like makes the perpetrator less bad, which I think is actually quite valuable, because we're looking at the cultural context that creates perpetrators instead of putting all the burden and then all of the cancellation and all of the work that is too much for an individual to do on an individual to do. Aruna Beth.
We ended up talking about more about what we had been talking about before. And I think the question was, some said, that they have liked Art Green's readings, and how can we hold the good things that person has given, and also deal with when they do harm. And do we not read those books? Or, some of us have gotten a lot of gifts. And we were also thinking about, Temple Beth Israel many years ago. Won't go into details. There was an issue with a rabbi and who was amazing. We loved her, and she did it, a not good thing. And had to leave and went through a whole thing. But there was also but she also brought gifts to a lot of people, but then did not such a good thing. And the same with Rabbi Shlomo Carlebach, who is amazing music, and yet some people are so triggered by it, we can't listen to it. So it's just like, how do we hold, how do we do the right thing and honor the harm that has been done, honor the people who've been harmed, but also that these people have brought some really good, amazing things to many people. So to me, that's like a dilemma, and we didn't solve it. We just were talking about it.
Yeah, I think there's no solving it. It's too easy.
But it's really painful. And I was remembering the time when that happened in Temple Beth Israel. And it was very sad. And the whole thing, because it's so mixed when you have mixed feelings, like someone doing something they shouldn't have done, and yet they also brought some really great things and were important in other areas. So it's very, how do you hold that? And the same with Arthur Green. How do you hold both those things? And what's the best way to handle it so that we don't lose the good?
Right.
Like by canceling.
Right. Because just as we would say when we're talking about a perpetrator, well, the fact that they did all this harm, the fact that they did all these good things doesn't mean that's the whole of who they are. We have to acknowledge their shadow, right? On the other hand, the fact that they had these terrible things they did doesn't undo all the good they did. And what does it mean to try to be a culture that looks at the possibility of a whole person? And I think I'd complicate it by saying, like, Shlomo Carlebach is dead. He can't do teshuvah. So do we have different responsibilities for how we hold the legacy of people who are still alive and still have the potential to do teshuvah versus our responsibilities to or around people who are no longer with us, but whose legacies of both harm and beauty remain? Sharon.
Just quickly, you had brought something up. These lone wolf gunmen who go in and shoot students, schools, we call them lone wolves as though they're just separate individuals. What we don't say to ourselves, it's the culture, the violent culture we live in, the promotion of violent videos, violent movies, violent behaviors that creates the atmosphere for these people to take that next step, to normalize it for them. We think, oh, it's not normal, but it's becoming normal. People now expect school shootings, not in their neighborhood, but there will be another school shooting. There will be another massacre. It's become, I hate to say it, expected, normal. And that goes to the culture itself. And I don't know how you change a culture. And that seems to be from all 50 states. This acceptance of having people do these acts and not an unwillingness to change.
That's a Parsha video I made after one of the shootings, one of the more recent ones. I said, this cannot be normal. It's really sick how resigned we are to this as the reality. Yeah, absolutely. I think the rate of violence by firearms is a collective institutional failure in the United States. I mean, you didn't even mention legislation. You didn't even mention the availability of guns in your assessment of our culture, but absolutely.
Yeah.
Right. Ken, you can have one more word and then I'll wrap us up.
I am on the email mailing list of the governor of California. I don't recall his last name.
Newsom.
Newsom, thank you. And he is doing something that I don't see any other politician doing. I don't even remember any politician since Bobby Kennedy doing it. As in every day, he is verbally calling those in the society that those institutions in our society that are just wrong. And he's just doing it day by day. I wish he was running for president instead of Biden. We just need more people that are standing up and saying, including the gun things. This is crazy. This is wrong. There aren't many people that are standing up and doing that. And it really might change things if there were.
And it starts at home, right? As I've said a few times since this class began, one of the most annoying things about Teshuvah is you can't make other people do it. And the same goes for institutional Teshuvah. It's so easy to look around at institutions in which we don't have power and talk about all the Teshuvah that those institutions need to do. But where we actually do have potentially transformative power is in the institutions that we are active in. So institutional transformation starts at home. What Teshuvah do the institutions in which we are embedded and in which we might have some power need to do? And I will close that with that question, as this has been a night of many questions. Thank you all for your time.
Thank you.